Good evening, I'm Thuy Vu. Welcome to This Week in Northern California. Big news today from the U.S. Supreme Court on gay marriage. Before we get to our other topics, we'll briefly discuss that with our panelists. Joining me tonight are Jill Tucker, San Francisco Chronicle education reporter, Mathai Kuruvilla, also with the San Francisco Chronicle, and Paul Rogers with the San Jose Mercury News. Well, the High Court announced it will review Proposition 8, California's ban on same-sex marriage, and the Federal Defense of Marriage Act. And Paul, we'll begin with you. What can we infer from this? What's the time frame, and can we expect any sweeping judgments? Well,
the time frame is the arguments are going to happen in March, and then we expect a decision by the end of the court session, which is June 27th. It'll probably go right to the very end. As for how sweeping and how big of a decision we can expect, that's sort of the $64,000 question that court watchers were already speculating about today. Are we going to get a narrow ruling one way or another on either one of these two cases, or is it going to be one of those once-in-a-generation social civil rights type cases like Roe v. Wade or Brown versus Board of Education? And I think nobody knows.
How much attention do you think they give to that, to public opinion, where the public stands on an issue, and growing sentiment?
It's a great question. I mean, if you look at the evolving public opinion on this, there were polls in 2004 that were taken by Gallup and Washington Post and other people that showed about 60% of the public opposed same-sex marriage. Gallup had a poll out last week that showed 53% support and about 40% opposed. Not only that, there were 4 measures on state ballots around the country last month, and all 4 of them, the same-sex marriage side won. So the justices can see the trend. In that Gallup poll, more than 70% of young people support same-sex marriage. So the question is, do they see themselves as a bulwark stopping something they think is moving too fast, or do they want to make sure that they're not behind the curve of history?
Well, it's clear that the people that were against gay marriage, they were happy about this today, even though it does have that potential for creating this nationwide ruling that allows gay marriage. I think we're up to how many states? About nine states and Washington, D.C. So there's definitely a lot of states out there that are going to be paying attention. That's
but on the other hand, we have 31 states, I believe, that have a ban in place. So this is going to be a very closely watched decision, closely watched situation. No decision yet until June. But, you know, we also have some other big local news as well. That was the big national news today. But in local news, the Oakland Police Department has, for the past decade, been under court order to make reforms. It stems from a high-profile misconduct lawsuit involving a group of cops known as the Riders. And now city leaders are hoping a last-minute tentative deal will avoid a federal takeover of the department. And Mathai Kuruvilla, I know that you've been covering this story. What are the details of this settlement, and what does it mean for the department?
Well, what this agreement involves is an agreement between the police union, the city, and plaintiffs' attorneys who filed this original civil rights lawsuit. And what they've decided on is creating a compliance director. Now, this would be a quasi-mayor of Oakland in a sense, in that he gets to, he or she would have the power to fire the police chief with the court approval. They would have the power to direct the city administrator. Now, those are 2 things currently that only the mayor has. It's limited in scope in that it would only affect the reform tasks that are incomplete for the police department. The city had been very concerned that a potential receiver or federal receiver would have oversight over the entire police department. So all 3 sides involved in this are very happy.
And this whole situation stems from the Riders case. Remind us again what that was. That was a police brutality case. Yeah,
there were some officers who were accused of framing suspects, and in the wake of that, there was millions of dollars paid out in civil lawsuit, but also this agreement on reforms that laid out various tasks that the department had to comply with. They're on a variety of different issues, but there are things like whenever somebody is stopped, a police officer has to mark down what was the reason why they were stopped and what was the outcome. Now, that seems really simple, but failure to do that very thing is one of the remaining tasks that's threatening the department.
You know, this was interesting because it was very important in Oakland. People have been watching this. That, you know, whether a receiver would come in and take over, it would have been unprecedented to have that happen. Yet at the same time, what they're addressing, not to minimize these civil rights issues, but it really isn't perhaps at the top of the list of the people in Oakland, where they are seeing crime rates rise and they are seeing fewer policemen on the streets. And just to be clear, this has nothing to do with that. This isn't going to put more police on the streets or address the rising level of crime, at least directly.
It won't directly address rising crime, that's correct. But what advocates would say is improving the relationship between the community and the police department is critical to improving crime. So overwhelmingly, the communities that Oakland police interact with are Latino and Black, and trust with those communities is not great in many neighborhoods. And so these reform efforts are critical, plaintiffs' attorneys would say, to improving those relationships. At the same time, we're talking about a huge cost. The city has already budgeted $5 million to deal with costs related to the reforms. $5 million would pay for 30 more officers in the streets of Oakland, where crime has risen 23%. Arrests are down 44% over 3 years.
Well, what I'm wondering about is everyone happy with this decision? It's unprecedented for a city, a police department, to agree to a court-appointed director like this.
That's correct. Nobody knows of any department in the nation where an outsider, a court, will have such authority over city spending. This compliance director can spend $250,000 at a time. But the city's happy because the scope is limited. They're just addressing the reforms. The police union is happy because they were worried that a receiver could affect union contracts and collective bargaining. They now have a seat at the table. Plaintiffs' attorneys are happy because now they have an enforcer who's within the department who will make sure these reforms go forward. Before, plaintiffs' attorneys would give advice. They would suggest solutions, but they didn't have any way to make them happen. This gives each of the three groups a piece of
a say in the matter. So what happens next? A hearing on Thursday?
Yeah.
With Judge Henderson?
Yes.
And at that point, he'll decide whether to approve the settlement or do something else.
What city officials expect is at this hearing on Thursday that's what the judge will consider is this settlement order.
How long do they think the receiver will be around?
At least a year.
At least a year.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, Mathai, thank you. I know you continue to stay on it and be at the hearing on Thursday. Thank you so much. Well, moving from crime to education, major plans are in the works to make California schools more green. It's all made possible by voters who passed Proposition 39 last month. It's expected to generate billions of dollars. It closes a tax loophole for out-of-state corporations and requires that half the money be spent on improving energy efficiency in schools and public buildings. And Paul Rogers, what kinds of improvements would be made to the schools, and what would this mean for them?
Yeah, these are the kind of things that aren't particularly sexy, like when you see people hold press conferences because they put big new solar arrays on school buildings and things. This is the much more mundane stuff, like new insulation, double pane windows, switches so that the lights go out when you go out of the building. And what's interesting, if you talk to engineers and energy experts who really study this stuff, is you get a lot more bang for your buck when you spend those bucks doing energy efficiency rather than doing these big elaborate renewable projects. You know, it doesn't make sense to take a school building which is old with drafty windows and put $1 million solar array on the top, because whatever electricity you generate, you're then going to basically waste because you're leaking power out the windows. And I would just say that Prop 39 is the most important ballot question on California's ballot that nobody paid attention to.
Yeah.
It passed by 20 points. Most people couldn't explain what it did. But this money it's putting in is $2.75 billion in new money over the next 5 years to retrofit school buildings. That is as much money nearly as the stem cell bond that we did in 2004, which was $3 billion. Arnold Schwarzenegger's million solar roofs, which was $3 billion. Nothing like it has ever been done on this scale in any state in the country.
Well, let me ask you this. How much are California schools currently spending on energy costs, and how much will this likely save them in the long run?
Again, it's a huge number. California schools spend more money on utility bills than any other cost other than the labor cost, paying teachers and other officials. And nationwide, we spend $8 billion with a B on utilities at public schools. So if you could save 25% on your PG&E bill, which is quite easy by doing these fairly boring, mundane things, nationwide, that is a $2 billion savings.
That's serious money.
That would buy 40 million new textbooks.
Wow.
And the thing is, not only that, but when you make that savings, the schools see their power bills go down, they can then spend that extra money on the schools. And so Tom Steyer, who's a billionaire hedge fund manager here in San Francisco, who put up $30 million to bankroll this, he is very interested in the math of energy efficiency. He gives a lot of money to engineers at Stanford to study it. He's funded similar things. And he believes it's sort of a double-edged win, that you save money for the schools, giving them more money, but you also reduce smog and greenhouse gases because you're burning less fossil fuel to heat or cool the schools.
You know, and I will say the schools, in talking to my sources in Oakland and San Francisco, for example, they are very excited about this money. Do not misunderstand that at all. They would love to see this money flowing into their schools. I think what I'm hearing from them, though, and what the critics were saying earlier is, number one, how is that money going to get to them, and what is it going to pay for? Because the reality is, there may be competitive grants, they're talking about things like that, but it's the legislature and the governor that get to direct this money. It isn't just free money that the schools get. So I think they're a little concerned about bickering and arguing about who gets that money, you know, how much power the union will have in directing that money. You know, can it go to training? Can it go?
There's no question. It's a ton of money, and the approval rating of the legislature is 10%. So this week, two legislators, Nancy Skinner from Oakland, Assemblywoman, and State Senator Kevin De Leon from LA, introduced bills on specifically how to spend the money. There are general parameters in the measure which basically says spend it retrofitting schools, spend it retrofitting other public buildings, or do job training for people, or all of the above, you know, installing energy efficiency measures. So what their bills are going to do are going to say essentially give all the money to schools for retrofits and have one agency, the State General Services Administration, set up competitive grant programs. So there's 10,000 public schools in California. If you spend $500,000 per school, you can do half of all the schools in California, 5,000 schools over the next 5 years, and then the program sunsets. So it's not a perpetual bureaucracy. Now, the legislature might end up wasting it all, but you know, there's at least some checks and balances. There are audits and things like that.
But overall, overall, a big win.
Well, it depends. I mean, some people were opposed to this, but there were a lot of folks, the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, a business group, George Shultz, the former Republican Secretary of State, you know, others who supported this. So it wasn't too partisan. It's a basic question of math. You got to ask people, do you have insulation in your attic? If so, why? And it doesn't matter if you believe in global warming or not. Why do you have insulation in your attic? It's to save money.
All right, but definitely a step forward in greening California schools. Thank you. Okay. Well, something else we want to talk about, an interesting study that came out. 1 in 4 young boys of color expects to fail in school by the time he reaches kindergarten. That's just one of the many troubling findings of a study by a state assembly committee. And Jill Tucker, you've been following this. What are some of the other alarming findings in that study?
You know, it starts with a very simple statistic, actually, that 70% of those under 25 in California identify as a person of color. So our young population is not predominantly white. And yet, these are the students, these are the children that are more likely to fail. So it's an economic issue for the state, and it's a real problem in terms of looking at the future of our economy. But some of the other statistics, when you look at that, is that 55% of Latino boys and 54% of African American boys graduate on time. So you start hearkening back to that 70% figure and then doing the math. 1/6 of African American males between the ages of 16 and 25 are either out of work, out of school, or in jail.
What are some of the reasons for that? Did the study look at that?
They did. You know, poverty is a big factor. Many of these children experience huge amounts and repetitive amounts of trauma. And I can hear the viewers out there, I can hear them yelling into their TV sets that it's parenting, right? It's the absent fathers, it's the absent parents in general, and that those caring environments. But I think what this study is doing is it's really looking at what the reality is. The causes are a problem: poverty, trauma. Fixing those is difficult. You have to lower crime, right? You have to get people jobs so that they get out of poverty. But what this report is looking at very specifically is a small subset of our society, young men and boys of color specifically, and what their circumstances are, what their status is, and what it is that the legislature, communities, schools, our health system need to do to address the issues that these men and boys are facing.
Because when they suffer, it really affects all of us in terms of long-term productivity, the kinds of state services they need, local services, and we all fund that as taxpayers. I think we all have a stake. Did the study talk about any possible solutions? Are there any models that they cite as good examples of programs for young people?
They cited programs across the state, many of them actually in the Bay Area and specifically in Oakland, where Oakland is already addressing, especially the school system, looking at this as a holistic issue facing these. They have they're focusing very specifically on African American boys, and they've created the Office of African American Male Achievement. And they are looking at healthcare, trauma treatment, mentoring, manhood development classes. I mean, they're doing everything from bringing health clinics from Children's Hospital into the schools to teaching these young men how to tie ties. So it is a vast system. These are the types of programs that they're trying to push either legislatively or through community programs.
And this is a shift in how we've looked at the achievement gap. Right?
You know, this really is a seminal report because it's looking at this issue from a different perspective. We've talked about the achievement gap over and over again, but this really is looking at a specific gender and to a certain degree a specific race.
All right, Jill, thank you very much for the update on that.